Today's topic is one of my favorite topics, and I might interject a question or two, but I'll minimize that because I want Parth, our new young host, to take over.
Namaste everyone. I'm grateful to Rajiv Malhotraji and the Infinity Foundation for the opportunity to participate in this mini-series on the culture and history of Kashmir. And I'm especially grateful to Professor Kak for joining us here today. Today we're going to start our conversation with a very important question in your field of research, which is, can artificial intelligence gain consciousness? So for our viewers, would you like to just give some background on how this question has emerged and what work is being done on it so far?
Right. Last year, there was a whole set of conferences that were held in the US and in Cambridge, UK. These were week-long conferences consisting of 30-odd leading scientists of the world in the areas of physics, neuroscience, computer science, philosophy. And the question was, in the long term, will computers become conscious? And if they were to become conscious, what will that do? And the participants took a poll, and there was general agreement that computers will be able to emulate human beings at almost everything that we do, which of course will have far-reaching consequences for society, for politics, for the way we live. But there was divided opinion on whether they would be conscious the same way human beings are. About 50% of the people believe that computers will become conscious, and about 50% said, well, while they would be able to emulate all that we do, they will truly not be conscious. And the philosophical background to these two positions was, one, the idea of shunyata in Buddhism. If there's emptiness and nothing alone, then maybe computers should also become conscious, and computation should be underlying the idea of consciousness. While on the other side was the philosophical position of Vedanta, that consciousness is the ground stuff of reality. There is something more to it than just embodiments.
I see.
And so we went back and forth on that.
So for this Vedanta view, is someone like the example of Srinivasa Ramanujan an example that sort of brings to light this idea of embodiment not being necessary for consciousness?
The question then is, how does one believe that there is something more? Because the mainstream scientific paradigm is that there is nothing but matter. And consciousness is an emergent property, and therefore consciousness can only be incremental related to what has been there before. But then the life story of Ramanujan offers a kind of an anomalous view, because here was a person who would wake up in the mornings and say that, well, the goddess came to him and dictated such and such formulas, and mathematicians, the best mathematicians in the world, have been toiling for 50, 60, 70 years, ever since his diaries were rediscovered in the 70s, and found that he was essentially correct, and many of his formulas were totally anomalous, right? They were not fixed to the mathematics of its times. And then there are many other stories also from all cultures. Some of the greatest creative people have claimed that their creative idea, the centrality of it, came to them when they were not necessarily thinking of that particular problem. Some people say it came to them in their dream, like Jeff Howe, the guy who invented the sewing machine in the 1770s in the US, or Kekule, the chemist who found the structure of benzene in a vision that there were these 6 snakes holding the tail of the next in a circle.
Wow.
And many others. And if that is true, then consciousness must be something more than just incremental combinatorial modifications on what is known at this time. And therefore, we ought to leave room in our lives, in our education, in our polity, to this capacity that consciousness possesses, which is beyond what we are comfortable in, which is our normal experience, and therefore that should provide us opportunities of imagination and action, which are more than what just a bureaucratic, top-down view of society provides us otherwise.
Right. So just putting aside the question for a moment of artificial intelligence, within the scientific community, is there any consensus on how to actually define consciousness before we even move on to the question of whether computers or artificial intelligence can have it?
Right. The leading scientific theory at the basis of physics is quantum mechanics.
Right.
When quantum mechanics was discovered or created in the 1930s, or 1920s and 1930s, and it was created by Schrödinger, an Austrian physicist, and Heisenberg, and there were other people also like Niels Bohr and so on. Their self-understanding of what quantum mechanics meant was Vedantic. In fact, Schrödinger himself says that the central idea came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, the great statement that this Atman is Brahman, or this individual is the entire cosmos. In Sanskrit, I am Atma Brahma. So the standard view in quantum mechanics for a long time was, which is called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, that consciousness is apart from materiality. And that is consistent with Vedanta, with the standard Indian view that consciousness is the ground stuff of reality.
I see.
And embodiments emerge out of it. But to be fair to the history of this subject, there has been a reaction to it in the last 40, 50 years. And some of the smartest scientists and physicists have tried to construct a theory of quantum mechanics, or an interpretation to be more accurate, which does not require consciousness as an entity which is apart from materiality. But in spite of all the efforts, all this has failed, because that leads to its own problems. Because if you're not conscious, and consciousness is just some kind of an after trace to materiality, then who are we? Are we just some kind of a sense that is left on the screen of our mind, and we are really like automata, acting our lives completely determined by whatever has happened in the past. And so it's really not gone anywhere on many different grounds, not just on grounds of aesthetics, but also its fundamental mathematical apparatus has not been able to validate itself.
I see.
So I personally think that the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the orthodox, the interpretation of the pioneers, still holds. And according to that, the Vedantic view that consciousness is apart from materiality is the correct view. And it is sort of different from the mainstream view of science and also of polity, that, well, all that we should worry about is material wealth, material prosperity, which has led us to wonderful, advancement of our material condition, but maybe it's also led to a hollowness related to a person's understanding of what their life is all about. And maybe a lot of stuff that we see, problems that we see, for example, the opioid crisis, drugs, and everything else is a consequence of that we are telling everybody, we are telling the young people, hey, there's nothing but your body and your sensations, and they have done this, and then they feel, well, since our body is going to die, life is not worth living, or they do things which do not necessarily bring them happiness.
That's very interesting. So you think focusing too much on the materiality has actually brought a sense of nihilism to the way we live our lives?
I do think so. I think focusing only on the body has led us to hollowing of our sense of who we are. And it's not only a dichotomy between what is the Eastern or the Indian view and the Western view, because the West had its own rich tradition of spirituality.
Yes.
But I think it's after the Second World War, as technology took off in amazing ways, and as it did indeed improve our material condition, that at some point we started worshipping only at the altar of materiality. Now, I'm all for material progress, but I think it should go hand in hand with invocation of the spirit, that the spirit and the body are complementary to each other.
Subhash, what is prana and is it necessary for consciousness?
Prana is this breath energy. Prana is like pneuma of Greek thought. So, in other words, it's energy. Energy which activates the body, right? Now, consciousness in the Vedantic view is from where prana emerges first and then everything else emerges. And therefore, prana is certainly a part of the sequence, but it's not fundamental to consciousness.
Yes.
Consciousness is fundamental, right? And out of that emerges, out of all of this. One must also make this important point that consciousness cannot be material, because if it were material, then it will have the kind of properties that all material things have, and therefore we should be able to find it in ordinary science. Because ordinary science, whether it's microbiology or physics or chemistry, deals with objects, while consciousness is the experiencing subject. Human beings in our normal interactions with the world are focused outwards, right? Our senses are focused outwards. And the whole question of how to turn one's gaze back onto oneself is the fundamental paradox of consciousness. So, speaking of it in ordinary language leads to all kinds of paradoxes because of the very nature of what it is. But there are lots of people, including some of the most celebrated scientists of our times, who are now coming round to the view that there would not be a scientific, namely material, theory of consciousness. And that's what the Vedic books also say, that there are two kinds of sciences: the material sciences, which are called apara sciences. Apara meaning a meaning not far, and para is like far of English, since they are related languages, English and Sanskrit. So para knowledge is the knowledge of the experiencing subject. And the whole idea, which is something that Schrödinger also stressed, was that in Vedanta, consciousness is a singular. It's like the same outer sun reflected in a million different pots of water in all its glory, right? So it's the same consciousness which gets reflected through the brain, which is like the pot of water, of all the individuals, all sentient beings. So this is an interesting point of view, which is very different from how material science has progressed over the past many centuries.
So if consciousness is the fundament and not prana, then even if, for example, materials like silicone, metals can't acquire prana, this breath energy, it still leaves open the possibility for them together in this machine to acquire consciousness then.
Right, yes. Well, the other perspective related to not just this question and the previous question as well, is that can machines themselves, because machines also are bodies, right, at some point become conscious. But machines only do what we bid them to do, and therefore they are only an embodiment of language, because when we ask something to do, that's a response to a specific statement of one kind or the other, or imperative, right? So from this perspective, no, machines will not become conscious. But if we were to, at some future time, build biological machines, then it's quite possible that these would be machines, maybe other new organisms that would also be conscious. But in any event, either of these two conditions, if machines were to become conscious, that's one perspective. then the question of what they would do to humans, because
Yes.
then at some point they might not need humans, and
Right.
therefore this could be a very frightening perspective on the future.
What work is currently being done now in your field to sort of replicate the human brain? And do you feel that this is an avenue that might actually lead us to developing AI that has consciousness?
This is a question that came up in the meetings that we had last year, and there were certain computer scientists. They said, well, right now the AI, one of kinds of AI that's being done is to replicate the performance of certain modules in the brain, because the brain at a higher level, not at the neuron level, consists of different modules, and they do various things. And one of the ideas that was expressed was that, well, if you are able to replicate the brain at the level of the modules, which in a certain sense we are able to, we can recognize sounds, we can recognize speech to a certain extent, or images, as Google and other software developed by other companies does. Then if you can go down one or two further levels down, and if we are replicating everything, if replicating the brain, then consciousness should also emerge, and therefore consciousness should be computable. And this was those people who thought that machines would eventually become conscious. However, just replicating the actions of modules, which is a linguistic representation of the actions of the brain, right? This is the stimulus, this is the response, really does not take us very far. It's still at the statistical level. A lot of AI is nothing but applied statistics, that certain such thing is correlated with certain such things. And at a certain level, it's indeed wonderful. It can do a lot, as almost everybody agrees that most of what we do gets embodied at the level of language. Whatever we do, our minds operate at the level of language. But that sets up this other dichotomy, if you will, that although what we do is linguistic and therefore potentially replicable by machines, but what electrifies it, what gives it vitality, is not linguistic. And therefore, it's like Plato's shadow in the cave. So we are only looking at the shadows, but we really don't know how to speak of the real thing in a linguistic manner.
I see. So it sounds like what you're saying is that computability, or just the ability to discern stimulus and then compute from that, make a decision, is not actually sufficient for having consciousness. So what, in your view, are sufficient conditions? Is self-awareness an important condition? Is recall important? What would you say are things that really indicate to us that something is conscious or not?
Absolutely. Self-awareness, for example. But then how do we determine that a machine is self-aware? Or even for individuals, how do we determine whether another individual is self-aware? For example, there's been this great debate going on in zoology or behavioral science, whether animals are self-aware. Claims have been made that maybe only the higher primates are. And this judgment is arrived at by asking whether a certain animal can recognize itself in a mirror. But these are tests being set up by us humans,
Right.
As our imagined sense of what self-awareness means, because after all, self-awareness is something subjective.
Yeah.
And it's quite possible that as we think more deeply about these things, we would conclude that animals are also self-aware. Right now, a lot of people think that only the higher primates are, but maybe other animals are also self-aware. And we would not be able to establish whether computers certainly are not self-aware, because they're
Right.
only doing what we ask them to do. They are just machines doing a specific task or a series of tasks.
So we haven't yet been able to design a machine that's able to go beyond the limitations that we pre-program it into, sort of,
Right.
is what I'm getting out of what you're saying. Is that right?
Right, and you might ask why, right? Because the brain consists also of an aspect where it reorganizes itself all the time based on the activity that's going on in it and the kind of stimuli it receives. And we don't have a mathematical theory of self-organizing machines. We have self-reorganizing machines, self-organizing systems certainly, but not self-reorganizing machines. So maybe that is the difference from a abstract perspective, that since that is lacking, maybe such and such thing is not possible. But on the other hand, you might say, well, who's to say that we may not be able to come up with mathematics which would make it possible at some future time. And so we can only remain agnostic at this particular point because we don't have that mathematics.
Let me interject here if I may. Assuming there could be artificial consciousness in biological machines someday, would such artificial conscious systems be capable of emulating what a spiritual guru does, such as Shaktipat or Puja? Could such spiritual processes in theory be home delivered by Amazon using conscious robots?
I think that depends upon people who participate in that ritual, because there are people who now don't use gurus for their ritual, but they have a machine perform it. And therefore, for example, a puja is also sort of done with a tape recorder in operation, and people go along with it. A lot of this is subjective, and therefore really one can't answer this question. There might be some people who would be quite happy to go with what Amazon offers, and there would be others who would say, well, we really don't have all the appropriate vibrations and atmosphere to do it properly.
Since you leave the door open for machines to replace gurus for some spiritual processes, can we take this one step further and ask, would such artificial conscious systems accrue karma for their actions? Since
we are conscious machines, we are also machines. Let's not forget that. We need to go to a doctor because we are machines, right? So we accumulate karma is this whole sequence of actions which form a part of our conscious or unconscious memory, which drive a lot of our behavior. So clearly that will always stay, and where it does, or how do you deal with that, is something where the wisdom of our tradition comes in, where Vedanta comes in, where it speaks of moksha. Moksha is transcending that karmic chain, because so long as we are a part of that karmic chain, we are primarily in our animal self, because animals are also a part of their own karmic chain. I mean, other animals, non-human animals, right? And we transcend that when we become free of that karmic chain, and there are ways of doing that. When we get absorbed in that infinite potential which is within each one of us in our consciousness. And so Vedanta or Kashmir Shaivism makes us have access to that fundamental transformation, which machines cannot have. And to that extent, machines, which are not self-conscious or conscious machines, will forever be limited as compared to us humans.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was this fear that humans have, and it's often played out through science fiction movies and books, that eventually the machines, if they become conscious, aware, they won't need us anymore and they'll take over. To what extent do you find that this fear is legitimate, is well-founded?
I think this fear is particularly ominous now because of what has happened in the last 20, 30 years, the media, education. Even if machines were not conscious, like computers, that run a lot of what society does, we are perfectly willing to assume that they do have this consciousness. So we are letting ourselves be ruled by machines. And therefore, to that extent, I think it's a very valid fear. And what is going to lead to a dystopia is where all human beings cede authority and power to these machines. This whole idea of a world state, right, where a bureaucracy like Brussels in European Union, and they are taking decisions in their best judgment, well, this is good for everybody. And that may not be true, because the bureaucracies think in terms of a machine framework, and humans are always struggling and fighting this containment of all the possibilities that exist. So I think one reason why there might be a major disruption in the way things are is because the human spirit is trying to fight against it, and in all their legitimate concern for the material well-being of human beings, these bureaucracies, which are these giant machines,
right,
which govern human society, are doing things which may be limiting that potential, that infinite potential that exists in the individual's consciousness.
So this is a really interesting view, I guess, because this isn't something that you necessarily see in at least popular culture. So what you're saying is that the cession of power will actually be from our side, giving into machines, giving into conscious machines, and sort of letting them have control over civilization will actually happen from our side and not from theirs.
Right, because, all right, we are not talking about at future time when machines have become conscious. But what is happening now is that we are ceding power ourselves consciously. And then we are saying, for example, in Europe, you're not allowed to have some thoughts. Certain kinds of thoughts have already been banished. And why are they being banished? Because they hurt some people. Right? And I think the same process is happening in the US as well. The universities have closed in many different ways. Only certain thoughts are welcome. Right? So human beings are consciously ceding power and authority. And in many different ways, this was thought of within the Hindu tradition, where we speak of this ongoing struggle between the asuras, which are demonic machines, and the devas, which are instruments of light.
Right.
Now, the machines and the light also exist within each human being, and therefore this struggle is to be viewed both at the cosmic level and also at the individual level, within the individual through his or her progress and struggles through life, and this struggle providing insights into oneself, right? But now we see it played so much, clearly at the cosmic level, and therefore one could see that as in the myth, where generally the asuras are triumphant until at the very last minute, divinity intercedes in many different ways, and sometimes by deluding the asuras, right? And then somehow, ultimately, divinity triumphs, light triumphs. So this struggle between light and dark here represents materiality, and light represents, transcendence, will continue both at the personal level and at the world level.
So if I can talk about a different kind of conflict for a second, which is economic in nature, just putting on my hat as an economist for a second.
Right.
We've seen over the past few decades automation take away jobs from countless numbers of workers, especially in service industries, as well as in manufacturing. If artificial intelligence gains consciousness, the impact would seem to be way more. What is your take on that, and how do we adapt to this change that's happening in our technology?
Well, I think automation doesn't even have to gain consciousness, because even without consciousness, human beings, most jobs will become redundant.
That's right.
Machines will take over. They don't need professors. They don't need 10,000 professors. Maybe just 5 or 10 lecturing in studios would be enough, because we already have technologies to deliver products all over the world. And likewise in other jobs, right? Not just transportation, self-driving cars or machines which replace human mind, decision making, through computers, through AI.
Right.
Machines already are as good as the best human beings at certain tasks. For example, the game Go, the world champion was beaten by a computer program just last year. And at chess, machines defeated grandmasters or the world champion many years ago, 10, 15 years ago. So most jobs will be made redundant. Now, very interesting from an economic point of view, changes that have taken place in the last 100 years. When the Industrial Revolution took place, at that time, perhaps 90 to 95% of the people lived in the countryside, because agriculture was labor intensive. Once agricultural machines came along, people moved to the cities, right? And right now, maybe 90% of the population in the industrialized societies lives in the cities. But the latest revolution in technology is not agricultural machines, but the human mind, replacement of the human mind. So a crisis is inevitable. So what will happen, we don't know. And ultimately, instead of maybe 8 billion people on Earth, maybe there would be gainful work for 500 million. And there would be a short-term transitional phase where population settles down to that 500 million people, where there will be a lot of conflict. And it's quite conceivable that what we are having in certain parts of the world, with people ready to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their cause, would be replicated many times over in many corners of the world. So personally, I think that there would be short-term conflict. Maybe in the long term, through spiritual wisdom, where I believe that Vedic views would play a very important role, because these are universal views. They apply to everybody, all
So
mankind.
what specifically within the Vedic tradition would help us navigate these types of conflicts?
What would help us would be the view that, first of all, that we are all one, and that our inner world is as exciting and wonderful as our outer world, and therefore all journeying and exploration need not cease now that the outer world is almost completely mapped out. And therefore life could still be worth living, which is not the case if you believe that all that there is just the outer world. Because, well, the outer world has already been seen, The explorers have reached all far corners of the world, and you can fly anywhere you want, and you've done it once or twice, then what do you live for?
Do you think conscious AI will help us better understand ourselves and the way that we work, what consciousness is, what spirituality is?
I'm one of those who believes that AI will not become conscious, but the fact that this subject is on the table forces us to ask questions about who we are. And that is wonderful, because we should confront these questions. And if we confront them, then perhaps the danger of ceding authority to non-conscious AI, which is what seems to be happening right now, would be lessened.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kak, for sharing your wisdom and insight here with me and the viewers today. And I hope to have many more conversations with you in the future.
Thank you. Really enjoyed.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for watching. You can subscribe here and also hit the bell icon to make sure you get notified. To donate, please click this button.